Back in 2014, the Flash television series started airing its first season and enjoyed fantastic popularity. I began watching the show towards the end of this season, and I, much like my friends, got hooked. The series seemed to have a lot more direction than the sister titles at this point, and judging by the pace the season had taken, it seemed as though the Flash had a lot of momentum and mysteries to explore. But now, 5 years later, I am left uninterested and disappointed in the story of Barry Allen and his friends, and can't help but feel that the series has not shown great longevity. In the preceding decade, superhero media has gained quite a lot of traction. However, this trend isn't solely attributed to the fact that audiences enjoy seeing superheroes fight on the big screen, but more broadly related to an interest in seeing how those superheroes fit into the real world. Likewise, character development is of utmost importance to the superhero genre. To take the film route, it is paramount to have a succession of multiple different films, revealing stories and motives of individual superheroes in a nuanced fashion, while simultaneously contributing to a larger overarching plot. Otherwise, you'd find yourself with a fairly lackluster product. However, another interesting route to take would be exploring the journey of a superhero through television. While a limited budget provides limitations to the genre, often finding itself leaning heavily on visual effects, it opens the door to a lot more nuance in character development. To me, it's why shows like Arrow and Daredevil enjoyed so much success early on. This conjecture, in my opinion, is exactly why Greg Berlanti saw potential in expanding Arrow into a fully fledged superhero universe, its first spin-off being The Flash. It was clear from the announcement of the series that the showrunners not only picked the character for his notoriety and abilities, but also with interest in mind in the storylines associated with the Scarlet Speedster. But while this purpose was maintained at the start of the show, I believe that the direction of the series has lost touch with its desired focus on story and character. The pilot to the series begins with narration from Barry Allen as the Flash, as the episode flashes back 14 years ago. Upon meeting the younger Barry Allen, the audience learns of the death of Barry's mother under mysterious circumstances, leaving his father wrongfully accused of homicide. From this brief introduction, we already see how emphasized Barry's backstory is to the series, with such a tragedy suggesting to the audience that a larger mystery is at play, implying a motivation for Barry as the Flash. Combining this with the concept of an emerging superhero, the benefit of exploring such a storyline in such a character-driven manner is that it gives the writers a lot of layers to unpack. It makes every episode either a new puzzle piece in solving the mystery, and even gives filler episodes more meaning in the overarching plot, as Barry improves his skills as the Flash. Indeed, no matter who Barry fights, we see that he does this due to his past. In the words of Captain Joe West, this is exactly why he became the Flash. In this way, the reveal of the season's big bad, Eobard Thawne, the future speedster who murdered Barry's mother through time travel, adds to the underlying story and thickens the plot, especially given the fact that he had served as Barry's mentor in becoming the Flash. The reason why most fans consider Thawne to be the series' greatest villain is because he dynamically fit into what the writers had already set up. He was directly involved in the core tragedy of Barry's life. His underlying motivation of going back to the future worked so well with trying to get Barry to run faster the entire season, as well as not being necessarily confined to the events demonstrated in the season. The final point will be clarified a bit more down the line, but the main takeaway here is that Thawne felt like a villain who actually posed a threat to Barry due to his intrinsic attachment to Barry's storyline and character development. This is why showdowns between Barry and Reverse Flash in the first season, while not particularly dramatic in spectacle, worked so well, as they were significantly meaningful to the development of both characters. A final point I'd like to bring up about the success of the first season is how seamlessly progression felt throughout its run. Thawne never received the upper hand because the plot demanded him to at a particular moment, but rather due to his own actions that were teased in episodes prior and then carried out. This, as we will see, greatly contrasts how villains were handled in seasons to follow. Now this brings us to the second installment of the Flash series, which definitely has some merits, but introduces a wide variety of issues. If we recall, Season 1 was successful because its mysterious overarching story was slowly unraveled, developing Barry's character along the way. This overarching story should not be stuttered, but should widen in scope as the seasons progress, because Barry's life is not literally bound by seasons. Essentially, there should be a seamless transition that pushes the frontier of Barry's characterization and story in a way that is consistent with what has already been set up by the writers. The best way to do this is to have an end goal in mind for the series as a whole, and work towards this as the seasons progress. It would appear that the writers definitely had this in mind. For instance, we have Earthbound immortalized in a video message telling Barry that he'd never truly be happy, even though he would receive everything he ever wanted. This message was an excellent choice for two reasons. For one, it calls back to the story of Barry's parents, which is assumed to be his primary motivation. It also begs the question of whether or not Thawne is right, incepting into the audience's mind that a future Barry Allen would doubt his happiness along the way. This should have given the season plenty of runway for character motivation and development. Unfortunately, a very detrimental issue began to materialize in the way the show was ran this season. Formulaic writing is perhaps the largest criticism of the Flash series from Season 2 to date. In the first season, you had Barry fighting a new villain weekly, developing his powers, improving his skills. While yes, it is important for the Flash as a character to become more and more powerful as the seasons progress, this cannot be handled in the same way as the first season. Barry has already faced a character with powers identical to his, and won. Well, sort of. But when Barry has already conquered stakes like this, and then struggles against lackluster villains like this, the writers have no choice but to heavy-handedly dumb down Barry at crucial moments in the plot. This is very jarring to see as the audience, as it not only undoes character developments from the prior season, but also implicitly telegraphs to the audience what to expect every episode. The mid-season finale is a perfect example of this, where you have Barry fighting 3 characters from the previous season. While yes, this is a fun filler episode, it doesn't contribute to the story in any meaningful way, as Barry doesn't really come out of this more powerful. Unfortunately, this issue of formulaic writing has not been remedied by the writers as seasons come, but instead has been compounded and scaled in the later seasons, as we will see. Nonetheless, I do want to give the season certain merits, namely in its antagonist, Zoom. Zoom arguably has been the sole character the entire season to date to have pushed Barry to his limits in a way that feels very meaningful to his character. Sure, the entire Savitar plot in Season 3 raised some stakes, but felt much more sloppy, heavy-handed, and repetitive due to a significant lack of interaction between Barry and Savitar. Zoom's name, by contrast, has been made clear to Barry as a looming menace from the first episode of Season 2. Implicit actions like these serve as indirect characterization for a villain, and therefore make Zoom's appearance in Episode 6 all the more threatening. I genuinely remember feeling a little scared after watching that episode, seeing how Zoom completely destroyed Barry after he had been set up so much in previous episodes. Zoom as a character is all about stakes. He captures Wells' daughter, breaks Barry's back, kills Jay in front of the entire team, captures Wally West, steals Barry's speed, captures Caitlin, and finally kills Barry's father in his childhood home. When Barry makes a decision to prevent the death of his mother, Zoom's actions as a villain throughout the entire season make this seem as a very believable course of action for Barry as a character. Not only that, such an ending makes the story feel a lot more coherent, as it calls back to when Thawne told Barry he'd never truly be happy. However, the ending was not without its drawbacks. The entire Magnetar dilemma, introduced and resolved in the season finale, could have been set up a bit better, but nonetheless lends itself well with the motivations of Zoom as an antagonist throughout the entire season. Nonetheless, this ending revealed that the series began following another dangerous trend, being the confinement of villains to their respective season, essentially taking the issue of formulaic writing to a significantly more dangerous level. In any form of storytelling, despite its structure, length, and medium, following the plot structure diagram is a very good idea. This is because it requires the story to have a climax and resolution it wants to build up to, and makes everything in the story feel a lot more dynamic. Thereby, every villain, episode, and character has importance and meaning. But with the conclusion of Season 2, it was clear that The Flash hadn't taken that direction. Almost immediately into the third season, it would seem that Zoom's brutal actions that had only taken place a few months ago were wiped in the memories of the characters. In fact, the Flashpoint arc, which I back then assumed would explore the consequences of Barry's action as well as Zoom's effect on Barry, only lasted 1 episode. You don't see Barry wrestling with the moral implications of Flashpoints enough before making his decision to undo the timeline. For instance, you don't see Barry talking about how he'd be letting Zoom win by doing so, once again implying that Zoom's actions don't bear any significance in the long run. Again, I do want to give credit to the writers, however, in demonstrating the implications of Barry changing the timeline, and how he wouldn't be able to completely fix it no matter what he attempted. It really does give Barry's decision a lot more weight. However, I feel like one mistake that was made in demonstrating this was the use of supporting characters to highlight the consequences, rather than seeing Barry himself struggle with them. it often feels like Barry is just being yelled at by the team most of the time, as opposed to feeling guilty himself. Anyhow, this is more of a detail, and I don't mean to get sidetracked on this point. The main issue of Season 3 is almost identical to Season 2, given how mirrored the seasons are. In summary, two speedsters with hidden identities challenge Barry and threaten his loved ones. This in and of itself wouldn't feel so cheap had the villains not been limited to the bounds of their seasons. If the audience is already expecting the villains to lose by the season finale in May, it destroys all stakes in the plot and makes the show feel a lot more improvised rather than methodically planned ahead. The epitome of this is seen in the season finale, where Savitar, a seemingly unstoppable menace the entire season, ends up being shot in the back of the head by Iris West. Like I've emphasized from the beginning, it's crucial for the Flash's writers to consider an endgame to the show, and then build the characters and sub-villains upon that foundation. If there is no importance of Savitar to the bigger picture of the Flash as a series, killing him off in such a heavy-handed manner becomes the only course of action. For the next 3 seasons of The Flash, the problems are more easily brought together and generalized. As the villains continue to be bound to their seasons, the villains become more like cardboard cutouts with empty threats, perhaps with the exception of DeVoe in some respects. Nonetheless, seasons 4, 5, and 6 make me feel like the Flash is beating the same bush and running around in circles, rather than pushing the paradigm of the plot forward. The protagonists have such easy opportunities to defeat villains such as Cicada, but don't simply because it isn't May yet. This issue is also prominently seen in how Barry vanishing in Crisis was completely undone, having been one of the main build-ups over the seasons. I think if the writers had taken that risk, it would allow for a new meta in the show, subvert audience expectations, and finally allow the series to build up towards some conclusion. Unfortunately, the issue of formulaic writing and lack of an endgame has just become more tiered from the beginning of the series. If the Flash vanishing isn't intended to be a send-off for Barry's character after all this build-up, then what is? I really love The Flash for its first 2, and maybe even 3 seasons, and I honestly do hope it improves. But as long as glaringly obvious issues such as formulaic writing and lack of an endgame and bigger picture persist, the series itself will vanish in a crisis.